The underhive of Gothalamos Secundus did not sleep. It only pulsed, like a wounded organ struggling to remember what life once felt like. Miles beneath the spires where imperial nobles pretended the emperor still watched over them, the air was thick with chemical fog and the smell of rusted metal, burned promethium and human desperation. Pipes screamed overhead, leaking unknown fluids that hissed when they touched flesh. Lights flickered not because they were broken, but because no one bothered to keep them alive for long. This was a place where survival was not earned through faith or loyalty, but through luck, and luck always ran out. Somewhere deep within that choking maze of tunnels and half-collapsed manufactorum ruins stood a structure that had once been a shrine. Its aquila had been torn down decades ago, melted for scrap or offerings to something far less holy. The locals now called it the Emperor's Blind Eye, a name spoken half in mockery, half in fear. If the Emperor truly saw all, then he had chosen not to look here. Inside, the air was warmer, heavier, alive with murmurs and the sharp clink of metal on stone. Crude tables were arranged in uneven circles, illuminated by lumen strips that cast sickly yellow light across scarred faces and augmetic limbs. Every table hosted a different game, dice etched with forbidden symbols, decks of cards made from thin plasteel, spinning wheels whose odds were whispered rather than written. The rules changed depending on who was watching and who was paying. This was not a place for amateurs. Jarek Vorn stepped inside and felt the familiar tightening in his chest, that mix of hunger and dread that had followed him ever since the war spat him back out half alive. His left leg was augmetic, cheap and unreliable, clicking softly with every step. The stump where his real leg had been torn away by shrapnel still ached when the air grew damp, which in the underhive was always. His coat bore the faded remnants of an Imperial Guard insignia, though most people no longer recognized it for what it was. To them, he was just another broken thing. Once, Jarek had believed in duty. He had marched beneath banners bearing the Emperor's name, rifle in hand, heart full of borrowed courage. He had watched men scream prayers as they burned, had seen officers execute their own for retreating half a step too far. He had survived long enough to be maimed, long enough to be useless, and long enough to be forgotten. The administratum stamped his discharge papers without looking at his face. No medals, no compensation worth the ink it was written with. Faith did not pay rent in the underhive. Gambling did. He approached a familiar table near the center of the room. The surface was stone, cracked and stained dark with old blood that no one bothered to clean. A handful of players sat around it, their eyes hollow, their movements twitchy. They were not here for fun. They were here because hope had failed them. Jarek took an empty seat. The chair creaked under his weight, protesting as if it knew better. He placed a small stack of thrown gelt on the table, coins worn smooth by countless desperate hands. It wasn't enough. He knew it. The dealer knew it. The dealer was an unremarkable man, which was precisely what made him unsettling. Thin, pale, hair neatly pulled back, eyes calm in a way that had nothing to do with peace. His hands moved with practiced ease, fingers dancing over the table as he gathered bets and distributed pieces for the game. No augmetics, no visible weapons. Yet no one ever caused trouble here. Those who did were never seen again. The game began, and for a time, the world narrowed to the rhythm Jarek knew too well. Place bet, roll, breathe, win or lose. Around him, others cursed softly or laughed too loudly, the sound brittle and false. Coins changed hands. Someone lost a finger. Another player gained a pistol. Its serial numbers filed away. This was normal. Jarek lost the first round, then another. His stack shrank quickly, vanishing piece by piece like sand slipping through broken fingers. He felt the familiar cold settle into his gut. Debt was not just numbers here. It was obligation, ownership chains. When his last coin was taken, the dealer finally looked directly at him. Out of funds, the man said mildly. Jarek clenched his jaw. He could leave. He should leave. But outside waited creditors, gangers, and a life that had already decided it was done with him. He had one thing left that mattered. I can offer labor, Jarek said. Security work. I've got training. The dealer smiled just a little. Everyone has training, he replied. That's not what we're wagering tonight. The table grew quieter. Nearby players leaned in, sensing something shift in the air. Something old and hungry stretching awake. No credits. The dealer continued. No weapons. This round, his eyes flicked briefly to Jarek's augmetic leg, then back to his stake. The words landed heavily, sinking deep. Jarek had heard of such bets. Everyone had. They were spoken of in half-drunk whispers, usually followed by laughter that came a second too late. Most claimed they were just stories meant to scare fools, but the dealer's gaze did not waver. "What does that mean?" Jarek asked, though he already knew. "It means," the dealer said softly, "that if you win, your debts are erased, all of them. If you lose," he shrugged, "ownership transfers." A pause stretched between them. Jarek's heart pounded loud enough that he wondered if others could hear it. He thought of the trench, the screaming. The moment the explosion had lifted him into the air and dropped him back as something less than whole. He thought of the administratum clerk who hadn't even bothered to read his name. "What kind of ownership?" Jarek asked. The dealer's smile widened by a fraction. "Whatever the house decides." Silence pressed in from all sides. The underhive held its breath. Jarek looked down at his hands. They shook slightly. He forced them still. He had already lost everything that defined him. Home, purpose, future. What was left to wager? He nodded. The game resumed. As the dice rolled across the stone, Jarek felt something stir deep inside him, a sensation he couldn't name. Not fear, not excitement. Something sharper, as if the universe itself was leaning closer, curious to see how this particular story would end. He won the first roll. Then another. Murmurs rippled through the room. The dealer's expression did not change, but his eyes seemed brighter somehow, more focused. Jarek's pulse quickened. Each victory sent a jolt through him, intoxicating and terrifying all at once. The numbers aligned. The outcomes bent in his favor. It felt impossible and inevitable. By the end of the night, Jarek stood up from the table with more wealth than he had ever held at once. Coins, weapons, promissory checks, even the deed to a small hab unit deeper in the underhive, a prize that drew gasps from the onlookers. A place of his own, a door that locked, walls that belonged to him. The dealer gathered the table calmly, as if nothing remarkable had occurred. "Congratulations," he said. "The house honors its debts." Jarek staggered away, heart racing, mind ablaze with disbelief. He had won. Against all odds, he had won. He did not notice the way the dealer watched him leave. He did not hear the whispered words spoken under the breath of the man beside the table, words not meant for human ears. He did not feel the invisible mark settle upon his soul like a brand cooling after fire. Luck had chosen him, and in the galaxy of Warhammer 40K, that was never a blessing. Jarek Vorn slept for the first time in years without dreaming of artillery fire or screaming men, and that alone should have warned him something was wrong. The hab unit he now owned was small, cramped, and buried so deep in the underhive that the concept of day and night had lost all meaning, but it was his. The door sealed properly. The walls did not leak. The air recyclers wheezed but functioned. By underhive standards, it was a palace. He lay on the narrow cot staring up at the stained ceiling, listening to the distant rumble of hive machinery and the muted cries of people living and dying several levels below. His winnings were stacked neatly on a metal crate beside the bed. He had counted them 3 times already. The numbers did not change. They were real, solid, heavy, proof that fate for once had blinked first. When sleep finally came, it was gentle, no nightmares, no guilt, just darkness, warm and quiet, like being submerged in deep water. That was when the whispers began. At first, they were so faint he thought they were part of the hive's endless noise, the groaning of old metal or the distant chanting of some forgotten cult. They slid through his thoughts without words, impressions rather than sounds, a sense of approval, of encouragement, as if something vast had taken notice of him and found his choices interesting. Jarek woke with a smile on his face and no memory of why. The following days passed in a blur of small victories. He paid off creditors who had once threatened to harvest his augmetic for parts. They bowed their heads and stepped aside, suddenly respectful. He walked through sections of the underhive where he had once kept his eyes down, and people noticed him now. Luck clung to him like a second skin. Deals went his way. Arguments ended before they began. When he returned to the Emperor's blind eye, the room seemed to part for him without conscious effort. The dealer greeted him as if he had never left. "You've returned," the man said, voice smooth, unsurprised. "Just passing through," Jarek replied, though they both knew it was a lie. This time, the bets were smaller, controlled. Jarek told himself he was being sensible, that he wasn't chasing the high of that first impossible night. He didn't need to. The wins came anyway. Not constantly, not suspiciously, but consistently. Enough to keep him ahead, enough to keep him hungry. Other players began to whisper his name. Some asked to sit beside him, hoping his fortune might be contagious. Others avoided his table entirely, eyes flicking away as if they feared catching something worse than bad luck. Jarek noticed the looks, but he enjoyed them more than he admitted. Respect, even fear, was intoxicating after years of being invisible. Each win brought more than material reward. It brought certainty. He found himself anticipating outcomes before they happened, fingers hovering over dice, a heartbeat before they stopped rolling, instincts aligning perfectly with the flow of the game. When he followed those instincts, he won. When he ignored them, he lost. The pattern was unmistakable. Soon, the whispers grew clearer. Not voices exactly, suggestions. Paths illuminated just long enough for him to follow them. He never heard words like prayers or commands. Instead, there was the feeling of standing at a crossroads and knowing, with absolute confidence, which direction led to victory. He told himself it was experience, pattern recognition, veteran instincts honed by war, anything but what it truly was. At night, his dreams returned, but they were different now. He stood before vast, impossible structures, towers twisting into themselves, stairways leading nowhere and everywhere at once. Figures watched him from behind veils of shifting light, their forms constantly changing, never settling long enough to be understood. He woke from these dreams energized rather than afraid, mind racing with possibilities. He gambled more, not recklessly, strategically. The Emperor's blind eye was no longer enough. Word spread of private games, invitation, only tables hidden behind false walls and sealed doors. Jarek was invited without asking. These games dealt in more than credits, information, favors, futures. He learned the names of Underhive gang leaders before they rose to power. He won access to supply routes that hadn't officially existed in decades. Once, he placed a single wager and walked away with a data slate containing Imperial Guard deployment schedules months before they were publicly announced. That should have terrified him. Instead, it thrilled him. He began to feel as though the galaxy itself was unfolding for his benefit, revealing patterns that others were too blind to see. Chaos ruled the universe, everyone knew that, but chaos had rules, and Jarek was learning how to read them. The dealer remained a constant presence, always nearby, always watching. Sometimes he played, sometimes he simply observed, head tilted slightly, eyes reflecting candlelight in ways that made them seem deeper than they should have been. Once, after a particularly impressive win, the dealer leaned close. "You're learning," he said quietly. Jarek frowned. Learning what? How to listen. The words lingered long after the dealer had moved away. Jarek's HAB unit filled with new possessions, better weapons, finer clothes, data, scrolls containing knowledge he barely understood. He stopped thinking of himself as a former guardsman. That life felt distant now, unreal. He was becoming something else, someone important, someone chosen. And yet, with every victory, something subtle was taken from him. He stopped visiting the few people he had once known. Conversations felt slow, tedious, predictable. They could not see what he saw. They did not understand how close he was to something greater. When a former squadmate recognized him on the street and tried to talk about the war, Jarek felt only irritation. The man's fate was already written, dull and unchanging. Why waste time on someone who refused to play the game? Even his memories began to shift. Details of his past blurred, rearranged themselves, lost their emotional weight. The war no longer haunted him. It simply felt like a stepping stone, another move on a board that had always been leading him here. The whispers approved. One evening, as Jarek counted his winnings, he noticed something etched into the inside of his wrist. A symbol, faint and angular, as if drawn beneath the skin rather than on it. He did not remember it being there before. It did not hurt. When he touched it, warmth spread through his arm and settled in his chest, comforting and familiar. He did not try to remove it. Instead, he returned to the Emperor's blind eye. The dealer was waiting. "You're ready for higher stakes," the man said. Jarek hesitated, just briefly. What kind of stakes? The dealer's smile was patient. The kind that matter. Around them, the gambling den hummed with life, unaware that something ancient and deliberate was tightening its grip. Jarek felt the familiar pull, stronger now, undeniable. He knew he could walk away. He also knew he never would. Because he was no longer gambling to survive. He was gambling to become. And far beyond the Underhive, in realms where probability twisted into prophecy, something laughed softly and adjusted its plans. The invitation arrived without a messenger. One moment Jarek Vorn was sitting alone in his hab unit, the soft glow of a lumen strip reflecting off stacks of winnings and data slates, and the next there was a thin card resting on the table before him, as if it had always been there. He did not remember placing it there. He did not remember opening the door. The card was warm to the touch. No name was written on it, no address. Only a single symbol pressed deep into the surface, the same angular mark that now lived beneath the skin of his wrist. When he stared at it too long, the edges seemed to move, rearranging themselves just enough to make his eyes ache. He closed his fingers around it and felt certainty settle over him like armor. This was the next step. The Emperor's blind eye was quiet when he arrived, quieter than he had ever seen it. The usual noise of clinking coins and desperate laughter was absent, replaced by a low, steady hum that vibrated through the stone floor and into his bones. The main tables stood empty. Lumen strips were dimmed to a sickly glow, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally along the walls. The dealer waited near the back, standing beside a door Jarek had never noticed before. "You came," the dealer said. "I always do," Jarek replied, and realized he meant it. The door opened without a sound. Beyond it lay a narrow corridor sloping downward, carved directly into the hive's ancient bones. The air grew colder with every step, heavy with the scent of old dust and something metallic beneath it. Symbols were etched into the walls, half erased and layered over one another. The remnants of prayers, warnings, and equations that no longer made sense to the Imperium that had buried them. They emerged into a chamber that felt wrong in ways Jarek could not articulate. It was circular, its walls smooth and unmarked, its ceiling lost in darkness. At the center stood a single table, larger than any he had seen before, carved from black stone that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. No crowd surrounded it, no guards stood watch. Across the table sat a figure already waiting. At first glance it looked human enough, cloaked, seated still. But as Jarek approached, his vision swam, unable to settle on any single detail. The figure's face seemed to change with every blink, older, younger, scarred, unmarked, never wrong, yet never correct. Its eyes, however, were constant. They were filled with knowing. The dealer stopped at the edge of the chamber. "This is where I leave you," he said pleasantly. "The stakes are too high for intermediaries." Jarek turned to ask what that meant, but the dealer was already gone. The door sealed behind him as if it had never existed. The figure across the table gestured for Jarek to sit. He did. "You have gambled well," the figure said. Its voice was layered, as though several tones spoke at once, harmonizing imperfectly. "You have learned quickly." Jarek felt no fear, only anticipation. "I was told this was a game." "It is," the figure replied. "The final kind." Jarek scanned the table. There were no dice, no cards, no spinning wheels. "What are the rules?" The figure leaned forward slightly and the shadows around it shifted. "The rules are simple. We wager truth." "Truth about what?" "About yourself." A pressure settled behind Jarek's eyes. He felt exposed, as if something were peeling back layers he hadn't realized existed. The whispers returned. "If you win," the figure continued, "you walk away complete. No debts, no strings. Your fate remains your own. And if I lose," the figure smiled, and the chamber seemed to inhale, "then you belong to the game." Jarek should have asked what that meant. He should have stood up, turned back, forced the door open with brute strength if necessary. Instead he nodded. "Fine," he said. "Let's play." The game began without ceremony. The figure asked questions, and the chamber itself seemed to listen. Not simple questions, not ones with easy answers. It asked about moments Jarek had buried beneath years of noise and distraction. The first man he killed. The relief he felt when it was over. The officer he let die because he was tired of following orders. Each question pulled a memory to the surface, sharp and vivid, forcing Jarek to relive it in full. When he answered honestly, the pressure eased. When he tried to lie, pain flared behind his eyes, bright and punishing. He learned quickly. The figure responded in kind, revealing fragments of possible futures with every answer Jarek gave. Paths branching endlessly, some leading to power, others to oblivion. He saw himself rising through Underhive hierarchies, becoming a figure whispered about with awe and terror. He saw himself dead in a gutter, forgotten within hours. He saw versions of himself wearing symbols he did not yet recognize, standing beside forces the Imperium pretended did not exist. With every exchange, the chamber seemed to shift, reality bending subtly as probability rewrote itself around them. Jarek began to understand. This was not about chance, it never had been. This was about choice, about recognizing which futures were worth sacrificing others for. The figure was not testing his luck, it was testing his willingness. Or seconds. Time lost meaning. At last, the figure leaned back. One final wager, it said. Jarek felt exhaustion settle into his bones, but also clarity sharper than anything he had ever known. Name it. The figure placed something on the table. It was a mirror. Not glass, but something darker, deeper. When Jarek looked into it, he did not see his reflection as he was now. He saw himself as he could become, unbroken, commanding, surrounded by unseen currents of power. A man whose every step bent the game in his favor. This is what you want, the figure said softly. Yes, Jarek whispered. Then the wager is simple. You stake what remains of your uncertainty, your doubt, your ability to turn away. And if I win, you keep them. And if I lose, the figure's eyes burned brighter. Then you will never again question the path laid before you. Jarek stared into the mirror. He thought of the man he had been, the soldier, the casualty, the forgotten name in a ledger no one would ever read again. He felt no attachment to that version of himself. Doubt had brought him nothing but pain. He reached out and touched the mirror. The surface rippled like water. The chamber screamed. Visions tore through him, faster than thought, futures collapsing into one another as something vast rearranged its plans. Jarek felt something tear loose inside him, not flesh, not memory. The final instinct to refuse. When the sensation passed, he was on his knees, gasping. The figure stood. The game is decided, it said. Jarek looked up. Did I win? The figure considered him for a long moment, then smiled. Everyone who reaches this table believes they have. The chamber dissolved into darkness, folding in on itself like a thought abandoned mid-sentence. Jarek felt the floor vanish beneath him, felt himself falling not downward but inward, slipping neatly into a future already prepared for him. Far above, in places where probability became prophecy, something ancient marked another successful wager, and the house, as always, collected. Jarek woke not in his hab unit, not at the Emperor's blind eye, not anywhere he had ever known. The air was thick with heat, metallic and fated, and the shadows around him moved like living things. His muscles twitched involuntarily, and he realized he was no longer entirely in control. He tried to speak, to call out, but the sound that emerged was his own voice, stretched, hollowed, layered with tones that were not his. Panic would have been natural, but the instinct had been stripped from him. There was only awareness, only the slow, terrible understanding of what had happened. He tried to rise and found himself constrained not by bonds of metal or rope, but by a force that existed in tandem with his own body, something entwined with his very flesh. He realized slowly, with a cold, creeping horror, that his memories no longer belonged entirely to him. Pieces of his past, the battles, the faces, the decisions he had made, had been observed, catalogued and excised in ways that left him hollow. Yet he could feel the presence of the figure from the final wager everywhere, a constant gaze pressing into the marrow of his bones, rearranging his sense of self. The chamber he now occupied was infinite and impossible. Stone and metal formed corridors that twisted back upon themselves, stairways leading into ceilings, floors dissolving into nothing. Other forms moved in the shadows, figures broken, rebuilt, unrecognizable. Some were screaming, some were laughing, some simply existed, suspended in mid-motion, frozen by forces Jarek could not name. He realized with a sick twist of understanding that these were not corpses, not ghosts, not hallucinations. They were those who had lost before him, those who had failed to claim their lives at the wager's end, now bound eternally to the table, to the house, to the game. It was then that he noticed the chains. Not visible, not physical, but real. Each movement of his limbs pulled him tighter into the rhythm of the game. He had lost, and in losing he had surrendered everything. Identity, autonomy, hope. The house had claimed him. The dealer had been nothing more than a herald, an intermediary. Now he understood the dealer never won or lost. The house always did. Time no longer existed. Jarek moved, yet remained in place. He fought, and yet every struggle only reminded him of the power pressing against his will. Around him, figures writhed and contorted, their own losses manifesting in twisted forms that were as mesmerizing as they were horrifying. Some screamed in what might have been rage or despair. Some whispered secrets in voices that layered upon themselves, indecipherable yet familiar. He realized that sound here was not simply heard, it was absorbed, integrated into consciousness, rewriting perception. He tried to remember who he was. Pieces floated at the edges of awareness: a soldier, a brother, a man with debts in the Underhive. But the longer he tried, the more they slipped, replaced by new sensations, new imperatives. A rhythm of movement, of observation, of wagering ran through him now, whether he willed it or not. He understood at last the terrifying simplicity of the final wager. Victory had never been the goal. Survival had never been offered. The game was never about coins, nor homes, nor temporary power. It was about extraction, about transformation, about the house claiming its due. He moved toward what seemed to be a central chamber, guided by an instinct that was no longer his own. There, at the heart of the impossible structure, lay a table larger than any he had seen, its surface blacker than stone, smoother than obsidian. Figures similar to him, shadows of lost wagers, were arrayed around it, frozen in a perpetual game, each with pieces that were not pieces, stakes that were not stakes. They were bound to the table, bound to the rules, bound to the house that had consumed them. Jarek realized with cold certainty that he was now one of them. His victories, his choices, his humanity, all had been incorporated into the machine. He could still perceive the Underhive, the city above, the countless souls moving obliviously in the Emperor's light, but he could no longer touch them. He was a ghost in his own life, yet fully conscious, fully aware, fully trapped. The house did not kill. That would have been mercy. It did something far worse. It erased the boundary between self and game. Every thought, every instinct, every memory became a component in the vast machinery of chance and consequence that it controlled. He was both player and piece, observer and observed, for eternity. He tried to scream, and found that the sound he made only served to fuel the chamber, to animate the shadows, to feed the next level of the game. Hours, days, centuries, none of these terms applied anymore. Jarek existed only in motion and observation. He saw new players arrive, desperate and trembling, each believing in the fairness of the wager. He saw their victories, their losses, their pride, and the moment the house claimed them. And he knew that he too had once arrived in such hope, and he knew he would never leave. In the Underhive above, his hab unit had been reclaimed, his belongings redistributed. No one asked for him, no one remembered him. The house had erased his existence in the world he had come from. And yet, here he was, more present than ever, bound forever to the rhythm of the wager, the pulse of the impossible table. Jarek understood, finally, that in Warhammer 40,000 there is no mercy. The Emperor's grace did not extend to those who gambled beyond mere credits. Chaos itself does not intervene, nor does fortune. There is only the game and the house, and the eternal collection of souls who have failed to win at the level that truly matters. And in that truth, Jarek realized, there is neither hope nor despair. There is only obedience, only the relentless, perfect structure of inevitability. He moved, as he was compelled, toward the endless table, becoming once again a piece in the game that had already been decided, becoming forever part of the house's dark, unyielding architecture. Jarek Vorn awoke to a silence so absolute it felt physical, pressing down on him, yet somehow alive, pulsing like a heartbeat that did not belong to him. He opened his eyes, expecting the familiar dim glow of his hab unit, or the distant flicker of lumen strips in the Underhive above, but there was only blackness. The air was dense, almost viscous, carrying a metallic tang that burned the inside of his nostrils. He tried to move, and found that movement itself was no longer purely his own. His muscles obeyed commands he did not issue, guided by some force that was both within him and outside him, entwined in a rhythm he could not break. Panic rose, but it was muted, filtered through layers of comprehension he did not fully understand. Fear existed, but it was catalogued and repurposed, a tool for observation rather than an instinct for survival. The space he occupied was not a room, nor a corridor, nor any structure known to the Imperium. Stone and metal folded upon themselves in impossible ways, stairways leading upward yet disappearing into voids that should not exist, walls stretching farther than vision could perceive. Shadows shifted independently of light, forming shapes that were just beyond comprehension, some human, some twisted reflections of humanity, some utterly alien. There were echoes of sound, whispers that seemed to rise from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, speaking in a cadence that conveyed meaning without words. It was not a place in space. It was a place in inevitability, and Jarek understood, with a clarity that was simultaneously horrifying and absolute, that this was where all who lost the final wager arrived. He tried to call out, His voice emerged, yet it was layered, multiple tones overlapping, not fully his own. It carried power, yes, but also obedience. Every sound he made fed into the structure around him, contributing to its motion, its awareness, its purpose. The chamber, or whatever it was, responded to him. Each movement, each exhalation, each blink of the eye became part of a system older than the Imperium itself. He realized, suddenly, that he was both participant and piece, player and stake, observer and observed. He had been absorbed completely. The house had claimed him. Memories rose in fragments. The battlefield, the explosion that had torn his leg apart, faces of comrades, orders shouted in panic, the endless grind of the Underhive, moments of triumph at the tables, coins sliding across stone, victories won in the whispers between rolls. All of it seemed to float before him, detached, rearranged. He reached out to hold one memory, to anchor himself to it, and it dissolved like smoke. The house did not destroy them, it assimilated them, threading them into its machinery, reshaping him from inside, constructing a version of Jarek that was useful, obedient, and permanent. Around him, figures moved. Some were indistinct, like fog shaped into forms. Others were grotesque parodies of men and women, stretched or compressed, limbs bent in unnatural ways. Their eyes were wide, reflecting the impossible lights of the chamber, yet none looked at him with recognition. They were all like him, prisoners, transformed into elements of the game. Jarek understood that these were those who had lost before, who had been claimed by the house, yet remained conscious, eternal, and trapped. They did not speak in words humans could understand. Their whispers formed layers in the chamber's awareness, feeding the rhythm, amplifying the pulse of inevitability. He tried to resist. He tried to will his body free, to break the invisible chains that bound him. For a brief instant, he remembered what it was like to act independently, to feel fear, to hope. But resistance was absorbed into the structure, observed, recorded, and repurposed. Every thought he had, every instinct, was now a component of the house's machinery. There was no escape, no mercy, only participation. Time did not exist. He lost all sense of past and future. Moments stretched into infinity, overlapping themselves. A new player would appear at the table above, in the dimension he could perceive but never reach. Jarek felt the pull of their desperation, the hope they clung to, the belief in chance, in fairness, in skill. He remembered his own arrival, the first time he had stepped forward to wager, trembling but determined, believing he could manipulate fortune itself. He understood, fully and painfully, that the house had never allowed victory at that level. The stakes were never coins, never weapons, never freedom. They were the self itself, the identity, the soul, the will, and all who failed were integrated into the eternal system, becoming threads in the web, gears in the clockwork, notes in a symphony that spanned dimensions. The chamber itself was alive with motion. Floors pulsed, walls breathed, shadows danced. Light existed but had no source, moving with intention, forming patterns Jarek could not fully perceive. Figures moved through this impossible space, some repeating actions endlessly, others frozen mid-motion, forced to observe, forced to endure, forced to play out rituals they had never consented to. The table at the center was colossal, blacker than obsidian, smoother than polished stone. It held pieces that were not pieces, stakes that were not stakes, forms that defied understanding. Jarek realized he was now part of the table, a gear in its mechanism, a note in its unending score. He remembered the final wager, the mirror, the pull, the pressure, the inevitability. He had reached for it willingly, convinced of victory, and yet he had lost. The house had claimed him. The dealer had been nothing more than a herald, guiding him to the inevitable. No one won at that table. No one ever could. Only the house, only the system, only the cycle. Jarek's awareness expanded. He could perceive the patterns now, the flow of the game across the hive, across the galaxy. Every act of desperation, every coin tossed, every wager made was a thread in the structure. Players came and went, each believing in chance, in choice, in agency. And yet, all paths led here, to this chamber, to this table, to the integration. Some arrived terrified, some arrogant, some calm. Each was measured, assessed, and woven into the rhythm. Jarek observed them all, simultaneously participant and witness. The chamber pulsed in response to his perception. Shadows wreathed, forming shapes that suggested landscapes, battlefields, cities, impossibilities. Figures from Jarek's past appeared briefly, friends, enemies, comrades, strangers. They were distorted, their features rearranged, their presence serving the system. He realized he no longer distinguished between memory and observation, between self and other. All were components, integrated into the structure of inevitability. A new figure appeared at the edge of his perception, trembling as it approached the central table. Jarek felt the pull, the same pull that had claimed him, that had stripped him of self. The figure's pulse of hope, the belief in skill, in fairness, in chance radiated outward. Jarek remembered his own approach once, the confidence mingled with desperation. He recognized the rhythm of the pull, the inescapable gravity of the house, the way it rearranged all who stepped forward. The figure placed their wager. He felt it resonate through the chamber, felt the machinery adjust, absorb, integrate. Jarek's own perception flowed into the system. He guided, observed, fed the rhythm, yet he could not interfere, could not act independently. He was no longer Jarek Vorn, soldier, gambler, survivor. He was part of the architecture, a thread in the web, a note in the symphony, a shadow at the table. He had become eternal, present, conscious, trapped, and fully claimed by the house. He watched the player above respond to impossible questions, face visions, confront choices beyond comprehension. He felt the pattern of their soul, the alignment of their decisions, the shifting probabilities as they believed themselves to act freely. And he understood, fully, that the house did not care for skill or cleverness. It did not reward hope, courage, or ambition. It only cared for assimilation, for observation, for continuation. Every lost soul became part of the system. Every victory was temporary, every arrival inevitable. Jarek saw all of it, and in seeing, he understood the grim reality of the Imperium, the universe, and the Underhive itself. There is no mercy for the desperate, no salvation for the hopeful, no justice for the clever. Only participation, only the house, only the game, eternal and perfect. He realized the whispered phrase from his past, scratched into pillars, murmured in shadowed corridors, was the ultimate truth. Lose the house, lose your life. Jarek had lost both. His house, his identity, his autonomy, his freedom, all claimed. His life no longer belonged to him, and yet he was fully alive in a way no human could comprehend, fully aware, fully bound, fully integrated. The cycle continued. New players approached, new wagers were placed. The house consumed, integrated, and persisted. He watched, he moved, he existed. Part of the eternal rhythm. Time, identity, hope, fear, all were meaningless now. Only the pulse of the house, the flow of the game, the inevitability of the cycle remained. Jarek Vorn was gone. And yet he remained eternal, conscious, a single note in the symphony of inevitability, bound to the table, the chamber, the game, for all eternity. And somewhere, far beyond the comprehension of any mortal mind, the universe continued, spinning indifferently, while below the hives, in the twisting corridors, the impossible stairways, and the shadowed chambers, the game waited patiently for the next soul, the next wager, the next life to claim. Lose the house. Lose your life. The lesson endured. The warning persisted. The game continued, forever, inescapable, perfect, and eternal.